All right, thank you everybody for joining the 11th Engaged Community Series panel from Sopri and Sajco. We'll begin in just a few minutes. We appreciate your time this evening or this afternoon. All right. So once again, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Engaged Community Series, a joint initiative of the South Asian American Policy and Research Institute, or SAPRI, and the South Asian American Justice Collaborative, SAJCO. My name is Jordan Stalker, and I'll be the moderator for today's conversation. I'm the research and advisor for SAPRI and an adjunct instructor at DePaul University in Chicago, Illinois. ECS is allowing South Asian Americans and allies to access knowledge, exchange ideas, and discover resources that support equity and justice in daily life. And each month we explore one of three core but interrelated themes: know your rights, unpacking hate, and civic participation in democracy, through conversations with community experts, advocates, and leaders, just like this one tonight. And SAPRI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization founded in 2001. Through community-based research and partnerships, SAPRI drives impactful policy change at local, regional, and national levels. It's dedicated to empowering South Asian Americans by advancing data equity and ensuring our communities are accurately represented in public policy. SAJCO is a civil rights and legal services nonprofit committed to advancing the civil and human rights of the South Asian diaspora in the U.S. through direct legal services, community engagement, and impact litigation. And we like to thank the Saba Foundation and Diaspora and Saba North America for their generous support of the series the whole way. And this conversation is being recorded and will be made available on SAJCO's and SAPRI's platforms. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to use the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can later on in the conversation. And so today's panel is Voting Rights 101 and Bridging Gaps in Community Participation. And so we are fortunate that we're joined by three leading advocates and experts in voting rights for South Asian Americans, and they have all been nationally recognized for their efforts. So first, we have Chanda Parvo, the founder and executive director of Save Texas, and Shobna Verma, the executive director of SAPRI and former director of South Asian voter engagement at the Chicago Board of Election Commissioners. And as always, I'm looking forward to the conversation. Hope each one of you is as well. And so we've heard things like elections won't fix this issue. My vote doesn't count. I can't tell the difference between the candidates. I don't know what the issues are. And I don't know if I'm eligible to vote. I've heard these statements in my classroom, in my community work for as long as I've been doing either of that work. And I'm sure many of you have heard those same things as well. Maybe even you began your journey because you didn't know if you were eligible and you were inspired when you found out you were. Or you are acting on behalf of others who may not be eligible. And we hope that today's conversation serves as a resource to come up with respectful, meaningful, and genuine responses to those kinds of statements. The 2026 midterm elections take place this fall, and primary and general election campaigns are in full swing all across the country. And having South Asian American representation on the ballot is one thing, as we do in many places across the country, from the federal, national, state level, local level. But the organizations represented on this panel are more concerned with the daily lives of everyday South Asian Americans. Unlike some previous panels, the work done by each of our guests is collaborative and complementary. Each of our panelists has expertise and experience working with voter and community engagement efforts in specific regions of the United States. But before we begin, I invite Shobna to give us a little bit of Voting Rights 101.
Sure. Thank you, Jordan. Glad to be a part of this conversation today. When we talk about voting rights, as a nonpartisan nonprofit, we've focused on voters' rights to vote, regardless of who they want to vote for, and whether we're speaking from an Illinois standpoint or national. One of the most important things that we need to clarify right away is whether whether you're eligible or not, and what does eligible voter even actually mean. You can vote if you are a U.S. citizen, if you are at least 18 by election day, a resident of your precinct for 30 days, and not currently in prison. And even if someone has had a felony conviction, their voting rights are restored after release. And this is a fact that many people don't realize here in Illinois. Two things that every voter should also know anywhere in the country is, firstly, we need to know our rights. We need to know the status of our voter registration. In this world of misinformation and disinformation, we can't afford to rely on rumors. We do need to check in with our state election authorities or a trusted source of information. We also need to know what our options are. In Illinois, we have same-day voter registration. We have early voting, which actually started today, and no excuse mail voting, which is vote by mail ballots. Not every state does that. I wanted to clarify that. But speaking of voting rights and recent concerns around suppression, I also wanted to share that suppression doesn't always look very dramatic. It doesn't have to be very dramatic. Sometimes it's very subtle. It can even manifest in the form of confusion, language barriers, sometimes long lines at the polling places, or strict ID laws. As part of this inclusive democracy, it needs to be practical. It needs to be clear to the voters in terms of who can even vote, how can they vote, and when can they vote, and what do you need to bring to the polling place if you're coming to vote. So some of the examples, I'm sure Chanda has a few too, but I can share one when we talk about the subtlety of some of these challenges. It's like in Chicago, after the 2020 census and the 2022 redistricting, the number of precincts dropped from 2,069 to a little around 1,300, which is like a 38% reduction. And this consolidation diluted the voter concentrations and reduced the number of precincts that met the language access thresholds. In other words, there were fewer precincts, which meant fewer sites providing language access at the polls, and all of this while the community continued to grow. So Sapri spent months studying the challenges faced by voters, especially the LEP voters, which is limited English proficient voters, especially around access to language support at the polls. And our research highlights the gaps in coverage and uneven resource distribution. So we'll be releasing a full report, in the coming days, but I definitely wanted to share that some of these recommendations that we're making will help ensure that this is an equitable process and access. So I do want to note, though, when we do have challenges such as limited English proficient voters not being able to access language assistance at the polls, there is Section 208 of the Voting Rights Act, where voters with limited English proficiency can actually bring someone to the polling place and receive assistance from a person of their choice. I think there are several options. We just need to be aware of that and do some prep ahead of time.
Thank you so much. Chanda, anything else? Voting Rights 101 that we should make sure people are aware of?
No, thank you for all of that information, Shobna. And I think I just wanted to highlight some specific things targeted specifically for the South Asian community in Texas. The AAPI, the South Asian community is half of the AAPI voters in Texas. There are 740,000 AAPI voters. We're 325,000. And when it comes to language access, you have to meet a minimum barrier to acknowledge that we have language need for a particular language. and we have 13 different languages. And so it is hard to pinpoint how to advocate for that language access. And so one of the projects we're working on is at least to allow printed ballots, but that's something that's kind of unique for our community. We currently do have Vietnamese in some of the counties across Texas. We have 200 and something counties in Texas. So some of the counties do have Vietnamese, but we have a long way to go. And I really appreciate all the research you're doing, because that actually helps to identify the issues that, are specific to the South Asian community. So thanks for bringing those up.
Yeah. So along with that, just very quickly, so I know that in Chicago, there are South Asian languages on materials. Is that the same case in areas in Texas yet?
No, we do not have them anywhere. We're just barely trying to get printed material so that if somebody comes in with that need, and that I don't know if we're going to get it for the primaries, but it's just something we started, but we might get it for the November election. So no, we still have a long way to go. Yeah.
Great.
I'm
Okay.
jealous. I'm jealous that you have same day voting, voter registration, jealous that you have mail-in ballots, but these are, sometimes it's you don't know what you have until you don't know what you don't have until you hear it. So yeah, we've got some different challenges.
Yeah, there's always more work to do, no matter where we are in
Yeah.
those in that fight and that struggle. But before we begin talking about bridging gaps and community engagement and what our community needs, has had successes, I want to kind of go more personal. So could each of you kind of explain how you got involved in this campaign as a voting engagement, voting rights activist, and how quickly, once you started thinking about voter engagement, how quickly were you able to focus on South Asian Americans in particular? Maybe Chanda, we can start with you. You're muted. Sorry.
Sorry about that. So Safe Texas was started in January of 2017. So we're starting on our 9th year. But we noticed something very quickly. I've lived in Texas for almost 48 years now and seen the tremendous growth in the community. But we decided in 2017 that a group of 5 moms decided we needed to do something. And quickly, we were having this discussion, is like our population has grown so dramatically, but what are the numbers? And nobody knew exactly what the numbers were. And so we said to ourselves, we're organizing here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Why don't we see if anybody across the state is interested in organizing? So we put up a Facebook post and said, can 200 South Asians across Texas like this page? And in 6 weeks, we had 6,000 people. And it was like a slot machine. It's like every morning you woke up and there were several hundred people there. But that made one very resounding, clear thing for us to recognize, and that was that nobody was paying attention to our community. And there was this starvation, people were starving to connect with each other. And so that was probably one of the biggest things that we did in the early years was unite the South Asian community across Texas. But as we started to organize, and I was like, okay, I have 6,000 people. What are we going to do with them? And then we started to realize very quickly that there was no infrastructure for the South Asian community. People barely knew anything about us. And so there was no investment in our community. And we realized that the work that we were doing just couldn't be temporary, that it does need to be long term. And Texas is really big. It's 4.5, it's equivalent to 4.5 Georgias. So it was really challenging to get people organized. But it was that unity that brought us together, where without any money for the first 6 years, we were able to organize an entire state. But it was with the will and the need of the community that allowed us to create what we have today. And it wasn't until about 3 years ago that we became a nonprofit. That's a little bit about where we started. And I don't know, Shobna, if you want to do your story before we talk about our successes.
Yeah, sure. That's a great story, Chanda, and I know you've shared that before. But I did not honestly start out thinking that I was going to focus specifically on voter engagement. It really grew out of a broader commitment to working with the immigrant and vulnerable communities. And a big turning point in my case came after the 2010 census, when under Section 203 of the Federal Voting Rights Act, Chicago and suburban Cook County, along with LA and I believe New York, they were required to begin offering language assistance at the polls for US citizens of Indian origin with limited English proficiency. And this was a significant moment for our community here because for the first time, there was a federal mandate that recognized that members of our community needed language support to fully participate in elections. And this happened after the 2010 census. So in 2011, the election board here started consulting with South Asian community groups and ethnic media and other community leaders to figure out what meaningful implementation would look like. And Chanda, you just shared there are multiple languages spoken in our communities because we're so diverse. However, with community input, a decision was made to move forward with Hindi ballots and materials. But what quickly became very clear to me and my colleagues was that just translating a ballot was one thing, but what was more important and needed was building trust and awareness. And that was a whole another commitment. As we engaged with voters, we began hearing about broader challenges. We started hearing about language barriers and discrimination and bias and other immigration related issues and lack of access to services. And all of this basically reinforced that civic participation is connected to so many different issues. And I think that experience ultimately shaped my focus here with the South Asian, not only with the South Asian voter engagement work that I do, but also continues to guide my work here today at SAPRI. We're committed to ensuring that our diverse communities not only have rights on paper, but also in practice. And this is, we want to make sure that democracy serves us all. So in my current role here at SAPRI, the focus is on just how can we continue to advance civic participation and, overcome some of the language and cultural barriers and continue to research and support more equity-focused policy initiatives. So that's my story, but we still have a long ways to go.
Great. Thank you both so much. And so we've got the personal stories. Now let's talk about the stories of your organization. So, and thinking about one or two, maybe even three stories that you can tell us and share with us as encouragement about how you were able to convince either members of the community itself to register to vote, to cast their ballots, to they become themselves activists and engage in voting activists. And so really kind of taking this time to promote your organizations, tell us a little bit more about it, and just show us and share with us what is possible in voter engagement for the South Asian American community.
Yeah, I think there's two stories that kind of just stand out in my mind as we were forming as an organization. And within the first couple of months of our organization, we went to my local temple and we're like, we should register people at our temples. And because nobody had ever been to the temple that I could ever remember. So I was like, this is an opportunity for us. I was like, these are pretty well-educated people. Surely they're all registered. And it ends up that weekend, we did it in 2 weekends because they had 3 different locations. But in 2 weekends, we registered over 100 voters. And the overwhelming question was like, why have you not been registered to vote? And some of them had been citizens for 5 to 10 years. And the answer was, nobody asked us. I didn't know how to do it. And this was a community that nobody was paying attention to. So that was like a pivotal moment for me for some of the work that came afterwards. I think the other thing that was really important for our community, I'm going to call it a success, because when we started this 9 years ago, we asked, how many South Asians are on the voter rolls? They said there were 300,000 of us. Said that was wrong because 800 people came to my wedding like 30 years earlier and the math wasn't making sense. And so in 2017, there was a candidate who was marking each and every voter with aunties and uncles with the language. So it's like Punjabi, Marathi, Gujarati. And as a result of that algorithm, we were able to use it across the state of Texas. So in 2018, there was 158,000 of us, and currently there's over 300,000 voters. When you look at the data, if you think there's only 10,000 of us on the voter rolls, everybody's going to ignore you. When you say that there's 300,000 of us, then people are starting to pay attention. So I think those two told me very quickly that one, nobody was paying attention to us, that there was this gap in opportunity for our community, and then starting to realize the importance of data, which you guys are doing so well at SAPRI, but so needed for the South Asian community. And that allowed us to build what we started to build. In 2014, only 20% of the South Asian population was voting. We started this in 2017 and 2018, we had a 60% turnout, which is the same as the presidential turnout from 2016, which is pretty remarkable because they usually aren't equivalent. But it was the highest turnout for the South Asian community. Today, we're averaging about 70% turnout in Texas. And in most cases, we're 2 to 3 points above the state average. The state average for the 2024 election was right at 66%. And we came in at 70%. We track it by precinct. And so we track precinct by precincts. And when we see where we're block walking, phone banking, and when we're holding community events, that's when we are extremely successful. And those turnout rates are anywhere between 75 to 85%. So we know how important it is to reach our community, because I think Shobna said it well. It was trust and awareness. And those two elements are so critical and important for our community, because for the first time, somebody was talking to them. When we were knocking on doors, people had said, nobody's ever knocked on my door before. So our success stories exist because people just aren't, it's just didn't, because we didn't just inspire people, we measured and we tracked and we built infrastructure and made participation sustainable. And not just one election cycle, but we're present 365 days a year. We're there when hate crimes happen to our community. We're there supporting them. When voter suppression issues happen, we're there for them. So the trust portion of it was critical and important for where we are today.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Shobna?
Yeah, I mean, traditionally, we've noticed that policies don't always reflect the real experiences of South Asian Americans, even though we've grown significantly in this country. In Illinois alone, our population grew by 55% between 2000 and 2010, and another almost 40% in the past decade. So we're looking at a community that has grown almost 100% in the past 2 decades. However, at SAPRI, we do work directly with the community to understand barriers, and whether it's healthcare, whether it's language, whether it's immigration, safety is a huge concern, and there is also a distrust of government. And what we do through our outreach and engagement is we try to turn those insights into action. And there are many stories that I would like to share, but at least one that I cannot forget is I already shared how we have language access at the polls here, but recruiting poll workers who are bilingual is always a challenge, because when we talk about lack of civic engagement, think about not only registering to vote, but that's also the starting point to be able to serve the polls, right? So when there are huge gaps in voter registration, think about the challenges when we're trying to recruit bilingual poll workers so they can serve the polls and assist with language access. But then we were at a community event, and as part of this community outreach for a municipal election, I believe, and met a voter who had been eligible for almost 2 decades, but had never registered, never voted. And we continued to talk, and they started sharing some concerns about a local issue that was affecting their daily life, and eventually realized that whether they vote or not, someone would be elected, and they will make decisions that will impact their family and community. And that conversation actually not only just lead them to register to vote, they also signed up to be a bilingual poll worker, because then they saw the need, not just for themselves, but the broader community. They saw their community members who could not navigate this complicated process because it was so complex and it was new. As Chanda shared, a lot of community members have shared that nobody has reached out to us. We don't even know that we can be a part of this process. So I think this representation, language access, outreach, and engagement, this is all necessary, because then people feel like they can be a part of this complicated process. Our work does not stop at outreach, though. In 2023, we did release a very comprehensive profile of South Asian Americans in Illinois. Our report is called Making Data Count, and it's available on our website. This research also ensured that our communities are visible to policymakers, and also highlighted the structural barriers that still exist, because we do have to overcome a lot of barriers just in terms of perception of the community, right? Like, oh, I thought you all are very well connected, very well informed, everybody should be registered, you're all professionals, you all speak English very fluently. So there are a lot of misconceptions, and I guess reports like these are important because then we are able to dive deep into the real experiences of our community and make sure that our communities are visible to the policymakers. And also we understand what the barriers are. In 2025, then we also spent a lot of time, several months, working on another research project called Closing the Gap, which focuses on advancing language access in our evolving electoral landscape. And this actually builds off of another research project that we did in 2024, where we talked to, not only voters, but also poll watchers. As a poll watcher, we had our own experiences. We talked to voters, we talked to poll workers, and we looked at the impact that some of these policies have on our communities. I think I touched upon this earlier already, that when the 2022 redistricting happened, we saw a reduction of 38% precincts in Chicago. And that reduced access to in-language support for our LEP voters. And when we decided we had to dive deep into it and work on a deep analysis, we identified that there were precincts where South Asian LEP voters lived, and yet they weren't being served. So I think these actionable insights are also important. We are actively advocating on behalf of our community. And when people say, why do you need to worry about this? We also have over 300,000 South Asians in Illinois, and we are 2.6% of the total population of our state. So I think it's important for us not just to focus on direct voter engagement, but also continue to research and advocate for policies that can keep our communities then informed and engaged.
Great. Thank you both so much. And I think because we, can't really separate, the successes from some of the struggles, but I want to kind of spend a little bit of time with the question of the idea of voting and engagement and electoral politics, and the idea that if every vote counts as one vote, how have you or how would you address skepticism about focusing specifically on South Asian Americans and their voter preferences and their challenges and issues? And with that, did you get any pushback from either government or offices or agencies or even members of the community itself about the work that you were doing? Again, why was there too much attention on this one group, again, for whichever reasons? So, Chanda, maybe you can start us off.
We didn't have any skepticism because I'm still convinced enough people don't know enough about us. So I've never received any kind of skepticism for the work that we're doing. Texas is a very large state, and I still feel like we're under the radar, which, goes back to the original premise of our work. It wasn't really always about turnout, but it was about misunderstanding and invisibility. And that's what I saw as a resident of this state for so long. I just knew that we were growing and that nobody knew anything about us. But as I mentioned, when we started this 9 years ago, we were talking to candidates and talking to them about the issues that were important to us. Said immigration was important to us. And all of a sudden I'm hearing about migrant workers. And I was like, well, it's not about that. And having to educate people over time that no, it's about employment-based visas. It's about green card backlogs, high-skilled immigration, family reunification. And so really educating people that were running for office or even elected officials about who we are. I remember like very early on, we would host candidates and we would ask as an icebreaker, and we figured that they would do their homework before they came. What is your favorite South Asian food? And they would talk about a Thai food that they were interested in. We just knew that there was a lot of work coming out, and it wasn't offensive, but it was revealing to our organization that we had a lot of work ahead of us. And it just fast forward to where we are currently. I know in 2025, there was a lot of Zooms we were on for the executive orders, and we were talking about know your rights. And what I noticed again is that there were many South Asian languages that were not present. And I think SAPRI and SAFE have both had to translate our own know your rights cards to make it accessible to our community. But also we felt like there were other issues that were not being talked about on those Zooms. And it was because we had a large H-1B visa population. 70% of H-1B visas do come from our community. So we didn't see a lot of conversations around that. We had a lot of student issues as well, and we had a lot of professor issues, and those issues really weren't happening on those Zooms. And so once again, we just kind of knew that we were an afterthought. It's not just underrepresentation, but it's a missed opportunity for democracy, for policy, and for Texas. And that's one of the reasons that we do organize. But looking a little bit deeper into Texas, um, we are we contribute enormously to the Texas economy. We make up 22% of healthcare workers. And when you're looking at something like that, and we are in Texas reducing the number of vaccines children need to have, this is very alarming for our community because we have such a large workforce that are in the healthcare. We also have the largest number. I think we also have a measles outbreak that is very concerning. But these are really, this is a voice. We are working really hard to advocate for the healthcare workers in our community, to elected officials on issues like this. We are 5% of small businesses, and recently our governor took away a lot of DEI contracts, and that is impacting our community tremendously. A large portion of our community are from our STEM students at universities and doing researchers. As I mentioned, 70% of our community are H-1B visas. And a lot of people don't know this, but a lot of our rural hospital workers or doctors are H-1B visa holders. And this has impacted rural access to healthcare in a major way. We are also one of the largest homeowners in the state of Texas, and that's important because we don't pay income tax. We pay property taxes. And so we are feeding the economy, having a large portion of paying the property taxes. I just want to kind of give you an example. The question is like, why focus on the South Asian community is because we have a little bit of political power, and it's not always being recognized because the data is not there. And I can give you a commissioner seat that's here in the Dallas area. That seat was won by 11,000 votes. And in that district, we had 15,000 South Asian voters. And out of the communities that came out to vote, we came out at 70%. So the question is, why should we pay attention to the South Asian community? Because once we start organizing them, that we can really get a powerful punch to get a lot of voters out to vote. And we've been very successful in the work that we're doing. And so it should be an important voting block that nobody should dismiss.
Great. And Shobna, how does SAPRI factor into this conversation?
Yeah, no, great stats there because we are actually here in Illinois also one of the largest, not only the fastest growing, but also the largest ethnic subgroup amongst Asian Americans here. So when we talk about, if the question is, why should every vote count? I think, yeah, every vote counts, but then what we need to ask is, whose votes are we unintentionally leaving out? If we're asking that question, I think that's where we fall. In Illinois, we don't collect racial data in voter registration, so we don't have those concrete numbers, but that's something we're trying to bridge the gap here. But we can look at the overall population data. If we live in a state which has over 12 million, almost roughly 13 million people, and 8 million of those are registered voters, that does leave many eligible voters not registered. And when we look at the South Asian population, which is 2.6% of the Illinois total population, and we are roughly 40% of the Asian American population. So if we're looking at 337,000 South Asians here in Illinois, I would estimate we probably have at least 150,000 that are eligible to vote. And if we look at registration patterns, if we follow the national trends, then I would say at least, 100,000 South Asians should be registered. And even with this estimate, I would say we're still leaving out at least 45,000 eligible South Asian voters who are unregistered. So, I mean, this is not a niche issue. I think it's a participation gap. And what we do need to look into are the gaps that are basically in the form of real barriers. I remember once testifying before a council advocating for language access for LEP voters, and I was asked, how long do you think it will take for your community to learn English, for everyone to learn English so that we don't have to offer language access? And that question for me reflects a very common misconception that everyone in our community is very fluent in English, is highly educated, and is thriving, right? But in Illinois, what we don't realize is 78% of Asian Indians actually speak a language other than English at home, and less than 23% speak only English. And about 14% of South Asians have had either little or no schooling. And when we look at the poverty level, we also know that there are significant gaps in several subgroups, but we're looking at 23% of the Bangladeshi population, or 21% amongst the Nepalese population, and 14% amongst the Pakistani population. And these numbers matter, right? When we talk about barriers, when we talk about access, when we talk about education and economic vulnerability, I think all of these intersect and they impact civic participation. So focusing on South Asian voter engagement, it's not about any special treatment, which I know I've heard that too. And it hurts because it's about closing some of these structural gaps. And when we talk about ensuring communities being able to understand their rights and have the materials in a language that they prefer or they speak, I see that, it has to reflect in leadership. And I think, yes, every vote counts, but then we have to have the responsibility to remove some of these barriers wherever they exist, and especially for communities that are growing and are very diverse as we are, and still too often invisible in our systems. So I think if we want, an equitable system, if we want a community that believes in democracy, I think this needs to be one of our priorities.
Thank you both so much. So voting access and just simple dignity and recognition have been, longstanding barriers, problems for the community. Has there been an issue or two that's come up more recently, or more come to a head in the last 2 years or so, than maybe in the past? Something specific? Shobana, you want to start off?
Sure. I think I can think of a couple. Maybe there are many, but at least some of the more recent ones. Again, because we're so rooted in the community, what we've heard more recently, safety is number one. I think the hate incidents and bias, they're not new to our community, but we also feel that they're more visible and are way more personal right now because the way our community members are being targeted. We've seen tensions rise, not only through some of the global conflicts that also impact the political rhetoric and trickles down locally. But what we're hearing from families is that they're feeling a lot more vulnerable. Parents are wondering, like, how am I supposed to even talk to my kids about bias, right? Kids who were born here. There are small business owners who are worried about harassment. Business owners, their employees have been targeted by their own patrons, right, and been asked to go back to where they came from. So when we talk about, our community's concerns, people still don't know how to. When they're being targeted, they still don't know how to report a hate incident or what their rights are. Chanda just mentioned, like, we had to translate Know Your Rights cards in our own languages because we work in the community and we know where the gaps are, and we don't necessarily have resources that are targeted towards our communities. So this gap is really real. And secondly, there's, I think, a huge immigration anxiety right now. Even families who've been here for decades are feeling very uncertain at the moment. There are, issues that we've heard for a long time. We would talk about visa backlogs and, policy shifts and a lot of misinformation that also hurts our communities, just because not only there's anxiety, but there is also lack of, accurate information. I mean, naturalized citizens, or South Asians who were born here, they are worried about themselves. They're worried about their relatives who are abroad, who are traveling. There are people who are feeling unsafe about their status. What's the future of our families here? When we talk about civic participation, some of that, these concerns often take a back seat, but I think they matter. This past year, we also saw some of the impact through targeted tariffs. I know Sapri is trying to do some research on that as well, but we know that South Asian small business owners, whether it's a grocery store owner, they're importing materials, or they're restaurant suppliers, they're all feeling squeezed, and the costs have gone up. And this is not only hurting the business owners, I think consumers are also seeing these prices spike on their everyday staples, and it's all becoming, very tangible, very local, and underneath all of this is a growing realization that, I guess, representation matters. We've talked about a not so engaged community for several years, but I think people are coming to this realization that representation matters. These decisions are being made far, far away, but they do have real consequences here at home. So I think I'm unfortunate, but I'm also kind of glad that these conversations are getting louder. And that's exactly why I think civic education and engagement is so critical at the moment.
Yeah, I'm gonna just bounce off, agree with everything that you said, Shobna, because we're feeling the same thing. A little bit about Texas is once upon a time the KKK was in rural Texas. They were in Vidor, Texas, Beaumont, Texas, Bonham, Texas. We call them sundowner towns. That's where they were. They are no longer there. They are now in the same place as our community is. So Collin County is currently the fastest growing population, the fastest growing area in the state of Texas. And we, as South Asians, are in the forefront of that growth that's happening. And currently, we have the highest concentration of hate groups in the same county. And so we're feeling it directly. And you can kind of see the nuances between, we are a statewide organization. When you see something like the Houston area, you can see a lot of South Asian electeds within our community. You're not seeing that many in our area. And one of the reasons is I don't want to put myself out there. I'm scared to do it. And so hate crimes is a huge thing. We are trying our best to get in front of it. My family all over the world are getting some of these posts that are happening in Texas, like "Don't India my Texas," and they're standing in front of our temples. We had something else that went to my family around the world. There was a city council meeting about how do you eliminate Indians from from this town called the city called Frisco, Texas. And so we're seeing it amped up, and it is hate crimes and hate instances are rising very quickly, and there's just a lot of anxiety around it. And it's kind of coming back to the elections as well, because currently, like, Dallas County and Harris County is considered sort of the turning point for Texas. And so in both of those counties, we are having issues. And in Dallas County, for example, the Republican Party at the 11 o'clock hour said, we don't want to do joint elections. We want to do separate elections. And so if you go vote this just happened like 2 weeks ago. And so, or 2 or 3 weeks ago, but so if you're going to go to your voting location and if it's the wrong party, somebody's going to tell you to go to another location. But now the rumor is, okay, ICE is going to come after us. Now it's a rumor, but this is the kind of rhetoric that starts to happen when you have a community that has a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear. Like, what does that mean for me? Should I go vote? I don't know what's going to happen. So it's a rippling effect, and it just is compounding for our community. So I would say, like, that's the top issue for our community, is sort of the voter suppression, which I'm really concerned about as our voting starts next week. But the hate instances and the rippling effect it has on our community in so many different ways, other than just living their daily lives.
Great, thank you. There is a question in the chat about South Asians as a voting bloc, and if you've addressed that or looked at that at all. And so again, the idea of is the South Asian community a monolith when it comes to voting? Just very quickly, if you can address that, however you want, Chandler, maybe.
We are absolutely not a monolith. We are on both sides of the aisle, and we do have some data available to us because we do collect them in our voter database, and we can tell some trends. And so when I started this 9 years ago, I would say 80% of South Asians were 80, I think nationally they said 80% of South Asians were left leaning. In Texas, it was probably about 70%. And then we had Hello Modi, and that brought us down to 60%. I think that was sort of like a pivotal moment for Texas. So right now, when I look at the data, I can see that we're about 60% left leaning. When I track primary voting, every year we see an 80-20 split. 80% are Democrats, 20% are Republicans, except for 2024. In 2024, Nikki Haley was on the ballot. It was a 50-50 split. And so we're seeing a lot of transition, but it depends, I think, who's on the ballot. We do tend to vote for somebody that looks like us. And so I think that's what Nikki Haley did for the ballot at the time. But we had, a pivotal race that happened in Tarrant County that kind of made national news, but a Senate district that flipped. And it did have a large immigrant population. And I think the fear and rhetoric of ICE is really making people think, like, how am I going to be voting? And so I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens this particular cycle.
Great, thank you so much. And the last official question is one that is looking toward joy and looking toward, hope. So you work in Texas, Sopri works in Chicago, and there are other groups that work in their own regions. If someone on the call or watching this panel, wants to start and knows the importance of voting and was so inspired, whether they participated in a campaign or not, but just knowing the idea that voter registration, voter empowerment, engagement is so important, but they don't know what step number 2 is, don't know step number 3. What advice or encouragement could you give to a person or an organization who wants to replicate what you've been doing in their own neighborhoods?
Yeah, so we started with absolutely nothing, no funding, no infrastructure, and no roadmap. And then 6,000 people showed up on our Facebook page in just 6 weeks. And it kind of felt like a slot machine, like we hit the jackpot. It just, like, every day you woke up and there's like 300 and 400. And so it was so inspiring. But we had so many people coming in, the messages were pouring in, and it was electrifying. And it was also validating for what we felt deep inside of us, and that is that we do have the ability to be heard and that we should be doing more. So in my heart, I always knew that there were more than 10,000 of us on the voter roll. So even when we found the 300,000, it was, once again, it felt like a lottery, like we won the lottery. And all the data again validated our presence. So it proved that we were never small, that we were just unseen, and we survived just alone on those feelings. So the energy of those 6,000 members across Texas all felt the same thing of being seen, being heard, and being empowered. And yes, it's still a battle for us in Texas because it is so incredibly big, but we're still fighting for a space on the table. We aren't always invited, but we're starting to build a chair at the table sometimes when we're not asked to be on the table, but that's the work that we're doing. But now we know that it is possible, and we're building towards the next lottery, not just luck, but a collective power.
Great, thank you. Shobna, please.
Yeah, no, that's a great question because when you're organizing in a community that's fast growing and underrepresented and not historically engaged, sometimes it can just feel like we're building a plane while flying it. I think for us, yeah, we don't have a neat roadmap either, but we do have relationships. There are instincts, and there's a lot of listening. So I think for anyone who's looking to, connect with the community and focus on engagement, there is no perfect recipe. Unfortunately, I wish there was, because that would make our lives much easier too. But what here's what we continue to practice. Like, we start with trust. The focus is not turnout when you start. So I think trust is important. We don't start with like, oh, hey, are you registered to vote? How long have you been here? Are you a US citizen? No, that's not how you build trust in a community, especially for a community that doesn't feel seen or safe or respected. So I think for us, it was more important to build that trust, to show up consistently. Chanda just mentioned that as well. I think, we've had presence at so many different, locations, whether it's temples, mosques, gurudwaras, going to businesses, whether it's a grocery store, participating in cultural festivals. We answer questions about rights, any other community, concerns. How does the local government work, and whether it's safe to share your information with us or any other entity. And then civic engagement follows. So I think the focus is on trust. And then with that, I think, we also try very strategically to meet people where they are, not just physically, but also linguistically and culturally. And that whether, that sometimes means translations, and also understanding that in many South Asian families, civic decisions are also collective, right? We talk about our collective power, but then these decisions are also collective. So we speak with the aunties and the uncles and the grandparents and the young adults and everyone. And the young adults are our ambassadors, who then go home and talk to their parents and grandparents who are not civically engaged. So I think this is more of, I think a strategy that we've developed over the years, but we also pair a lot of these stories with data, and because we strongly believe that numbers matter. So I think for us, whether people are eligible or not registered, but telling the stories, I think also helps not only move people, but also policymakers. So I think one thing that I would just highly recommend is, building that trust in the community, being consistent. Don't just show up during election season, because a lot of people think that, okay, it's an election, another election cycle, I'm going to show up and register voters. That's not going to result into any kind of turnout. So I think that year-round consistent presence in the community also builds credibility, and that's how we approach.
Oh, great. Well, thank you both so much. Anything else that you wanted to share with us?
No, I'm really thankful that we're having this conversation, because, we know that our communities are very diverse, and we've seen, some generational, differences there as well. A lot of youth that we engage with, if they are listening to us today, a lot of youth has, shared with us that they did not grow up discussing civic engagement during, dinner. In fact, if anything, parents would discourage them from being too active on campus. Keep your heads down, focus on your grades. But I think those times have changed, and I'm just glad to see a lot of motivation and engagement from the young South Asians, but then how that's also influencing and impacting our older adults.
Great.
Yeah, I'm just excited to see the South Asian community coming together. So excited that we've built like a table at a national level where all of these organizations are talking to each other. Because, in the early years, 9 years ago, didn't know all these wonderful people, but just coming together and sharing that, oh, we all are sharing like the same issues and the same concerns. And South Asians are the fastest growing minority population in the country, and definitely in Texas. Texas has the second largest South Asian population, almost at about 2 million people. But how do you give voice to a community that has often been overlooked and underrepresented? So thank you so much for even having this panel, in giving voice to our community.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you to the panelists and to the attendees, for joining the conversation. And we honestly hope that you are going to leave feeling refreshed, encouraged, and inspired to act in the way that makes sense to you. Of course, without having harm come to you, but to really be as vibrant and bold as you can. And because the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, and each one of us can really encourage someone right in front of us, whether it's voting rights, basic dignity, human rights, and really to have their voice heard. And so to wrap up, some housekeeping notes from ECS. And so SOPRI is doing a live survey about immigrant experiences, and that's going to be dropped into the chat and will be also sent via link to everyone who registered for today. And we'll also have key takeaways from today's panel, including some basic resources, because there was a note in the chat about what do these terms mean? And that's maybe something that if you are engaged in the work and enmeshed in the work, we already kind of know those basic steps. Sometimes we forget to do those real, those 101s. And so we will prepare resources and also share those out in the upcoming recap email. And then we have our final panel of the ECS series coming up on March 25th, the same time as always, 6 p.m. Eastern, 5 Central, 3 Pacific. And that's going to be civic responsibility and activism, mobilizing communities for lasting change. And as always, we will have the link for you to register. Thanks again for spending your time with us, and we look forward to seeing you next time. All right, and this concludes ECS panel number 11.